The War of the Ring was the final climactic conflict of the Third Age. It lasted from the 20th of June 3018 to the 3rd of November 3019, with the hottest period being between the 25th of February to the 27th of March 3019. With battles being fought across all of the Westlands, this was one of the bloodiest wars of the Third Age. Or was it? In this video, we take a look at the War of the Ring and estimate what the death toll might have been for the entire conflict. Before I start, I do want to say that, and you've probably heard this many times, Tolkien never gave us numbers. He didn't give us population numbers, he only gave out some military numbers. Thus, we don't actually know how many people died during the War of the Ring. As per usual, I'll be using the numbers he did give us and other bits of evidence from his writing to come to a rough conclusion about how many people might have died. So yeah, this video isn't giving a canon answer, but I hope it does give us an answer that would fit roughly in the realm of canon. First, I want to talk about the military deaths for the Free Peoples. We do get some numbers here. Rohan is meant to have at least 12,000 soldiers at the start of the war. Gondor probably has at least double that, possibly up to 30,000. However, we don't have the numbers for any of the other participants in the war, namely the Elves of Lothlorien and Mirkwood, the Men of Dale and the Dwarves of Erebor. All we know is that, individually, their forces were smaller than those of Gondor or Rohan, as they were the two strongest powers in the Westlands. If I had to guess a range, I'd say Dale, Mirkwood and Erebor would have between 3,000 to 7,000, while Lothlorien's range would be a smaller 2,000 to 4,000. The first major campaign of the war was fought in Rohan, across three major battles, the two battles of the Fords of Isen and the Battle of the Hornburg. Now, Rohan lost both the battles at the Fords and came very close to losing the Battle of the Hornburg. This might lead one to assume that Rohan's losses were major, but this isn't really true. One must remember that many of Rohan's soldiers were not mobilized against Isengard. It was mostly just men from the Westmark and about 1,500 soldiers from the Fold. Pretty much the entirety of the Eastmark did not fight against Isengard. We also know the rough number of soldiers fought across the two battles of the Fords of Isen, and we know that many of the surviving soldiers made up the 1,000 reinforcements that arrived at Helm's Deep. We also know that, for example, the 500 soldiers from Edoras led by Elfhelm withdrew from the Fords of Isen without loss. Basically, when we look at all of these numbers together, it becomes clear that against Isengard, Rohan probably lost 3,000 soldiers at most, and probably closer to 2,000. This explains how Theoden took 6,000 soldiers to Gondor, while also leaving behind soldiers to defend his kingdom. And at the Pelennor Fields, we're told that the Rohirrim lost another 2,000 men. Their remaining forces were then divided, 1,000 marched with Aragorn to the Black Gate, and 3,000 went with Elfhelm to destroy Mordor's army in Anórien. I don't think the casualties in either of these battles would have been high at all, maybe a few hundred at absolute most. So across the entirety of the War of the Ring, we're looking at Rohan losing around 4,000 to 5,000 men. Considering they started with at least 12,000, the death toll for the Rohirrim was actually quite high. But one must also remember that the Rohirrim probably had the highest participation rate of the War of the Ring. Then we have Gondor. Gondor is tough because we only have bits and pieces when it comes to numbers. For example, the Southern Fiefs sent around 2,000 to 3,000 men to Minas Tirith originally, and Angbor, Lord of Lamadon, was later leading an army of 4,000 more to Minas Tirith. We also know that 6,000 of the men that Aragorn led to the Black Gate were Gondorians. At least some of these men would have belonged to the 2,000 to 3,000 from the Southern Fiefs. But, once again, from piecing these numbers together, we can conclude that Gondor's losses also weren't that high, despite the bloody fighting that took place across much of eastern and southern Gondor. The reason for this is information we received from the last debate. Of the 6,000 Gondorians that march on the Black Gate, 3,500 are from those who were defending Osgiliath and Minas Tirith. This isn't super helpful by itself, because we don't know how many soldiers were originally defending, nor do we know how many were lost, except that Faramir apparently lost a third of his force that was defending Osgiliath and the Ramesses. However, we are told that once Angbor's 4,000 arrived to Minas Tirith, along with an unknown number of other men sailing up the Anduin, even with the host of the West leaving, the city would be better defended than it was before the siege of Gondor began. It's unclear if Elfhelm's 3,000 Rohirrim would be considered part of the city's defense. Either way, this means that Gondor's forces at Osgiliath and Minas Tirith could not have been that high, maybe no higher than 5,000, and almost certainly no higher than 7,000. If at least 3,500 were remaining after the battle, then Gondor's losses in those battles really couldn't have been any more than 3,000 to 4,000. However, this wouldn't be the grand total of Gondor's losses because there was plenty of other fighting. The First Battle of Osgiliath in June 3018, the ambush in Ithilien, the loss of Caer Andros, the loss of Pelargir, the other battles fought along the coast, and then the battle at the Black Gate. It's unfortunately impossible to come up with an exact number, but if I had to guess, losses across these battles might number 2 to 3 or maybe 4,000. So across the war, I'd say Gondor lost a minimum of 4,000 men, but probably more likely around 6,000. Okay, so what about the rest of the Free Peoples? Well, it's once again very hard to know. All we can do is go by the description of these battles. I'd say the smallest losses were at Lothlorien, because it's said that the power there was so great that Sauron himself would have had to come forth to dispel it. There's also the fact that despite the 3 assaults, the Elves of Lothlorien still had the strength to cross to Anduin themselves and destroy Dol Guldur. I'd say anywhere between a couple hundred to 1,000. In Mirkwood, we're told that there was a long battle and a great ruin of fire. The Mirkwood Elves had the advantage of only facing 1 assault, but they had the disadvantage of not having a major river and not having Galadriel wielding a ring of power defending them. Honestly, I'd say 1,500 to 3,000 in terms of losses. As for the Dwarves of Erebor and the Men of Dale, this is an interesting one because they actually lost the first major battle, the Battle of Dale. After 3 days of fighting, they were forced to abandon the field and take refuge inside Erebor. This would imply that their losses were much higher. However, we must also remember that they then still had the strength to drive off the Easterling invaders after Sauron was defeated. For both the Dwarves and the Men of Dale, I'd say the losses were probably 2,000 each the minimum, but probably more likely between 3 to 4,000. And then there's other losses. The losses from the Shire and the Men of Bree are pretty negligible, so they don't have a big impact. But we do know that fighting took place across Rhovanion. From Amon Hen, Frodo witnessed the woodmen battling in Mirkwood, and he saw smoke rising from the Vales of Anduin, suggesting that Beornings were under attack too. Unfortunately, we don't know how big these groups were, we don't know the scale and the ferocity of the fighting, and therefore we can't accurately estimate the losses. All I can say is that I can't imagine they were too high, so probably 1,000 at most. So for the military losses of the Free Peoples, I'd say the minimum losses were probably around 15,000, and the maximum losses were around 25,000, with most of those losses occurring at the Battle of Pelennor Fields and the Battle of Dale. This would make sense as those were the 2 largest battles of the war. While these losses would ultimately pale in comparison to the losses that Sauron's forces sustained, one must remember that the total military strength of the Free Peoples probably wasn't much more than 60,000 at a maximum, so losses of 15 to 25,000 were significant losses at the end of the day. Okay, let's move on to civilians. This one is even more difficult to measure, but I will once again say it probably wasn't as high as you think. The reason for this is that the Free Peoples did a reasonably good job at defending their territory. Many of the attacks were stopped at the border, or at least didn't penetrate that far into their lands. And those that did make it far didn't find masses of civilians to slaughter. The invasions of the War of the Ring had been long expected, so many places were prepared for them. For example, Minas Tirith was evacuated of most non-combatants well before the siege began. This wasn't the only example. Before the Battle of the Hornburg, we're told that 3/4 of the folk of the Westfold had made it to the fortress and were now gathered in the Glittering Caves. While not explicitly stated, we might also assume that places like Pelargir and Dale were evacuated too, because there's no mention of the cities being brutally sacked, nor of the mention of the slaughter of civilians. So it seems that places that were perceived to be on the front line or under major threat were evacuated before they were attacked. That said, these measures weren't perfect. I said just before that 3/4 of the folk of the Westfold made it to Helm's Deep. Well, unfortunately, many belonging to that last quarter seem to have been killed. When they're approaching Helm's Deep, Theoden's scouts report that many folk have already been slain in the fields as they fled towards the fortress. After the battle, it's noted there are many carrion birds lurking around, and at Isengard, Theoden angrily rebukes Saruman's offer of peace, pointing out that children were amongst the dead. It's hard to know how many people actually died because we don't know the population of the Westfold nor all of Rohan. I've seen estimates of anywhere between 200,000 to 500,000. As one of Rohan's most populated regions, the Westfold would make up a significant portion of that number, possibly 100,000 or more. So we might say that 25,000 people died, but that's hardly a bulletproof estimate because A, we obviously don't know how many people lived there, and B, it's certainly not guaranteed that all of those who didn't make it to Helm's Deep died, and C, Saruman's army only had a single day to ravage the Westfold, so they were kind of limited in the amount of killing they could achieve. So it's entirely possible that only a few thousand people died at most. I don't think the Westfold would be the only place that civilians died. In other places that were attacked, it's possible, even probable, that civilians were killed because they didn't evacuate in time, were unable to evacuate, refused to evacuate, or perhaps they were unfortunate enough to be killed when their respective fortresses were attacked or besieged. But honestly, guessing at these numbers is a fool's errand because we literally have almost nothing to measure with. That doesn't mean I'm just not going to give an answer. While I have zero confidence in giving exact numbers or even a decent range, I will say that I don't believe the civilian deaths outnumbered the military deaths. As I said earlier, the Free Peoples did a remarkable job of defending their borders and population centres, and very few places were truly overrun. So yeah, at an absolute maximum, I'd say civilian deaths might have been around 20,000, with most of those deaths occurring in the Westfold. That said, I wouldn't be surprised if civilian deaths were closer to 10,000 or even less. So for the Free Peoples, I think total deaths was 50,000 at an absolute maximum, and probably 20,000 at an absolute minimum, which gives us the sweet spot of around 30,000. Considering the scale of the war, I'd say that 30,000 is a fairly low number, and I'd say that means the War of the Ring actually ranks rather low in terms of the bloodiest wars in Middle-earth's history. In fact, I'd say that more people died in conflicts such as the Angmar invasions of 1409 and 1974-75, the Kinstrife, and the Wainwriter invasion of 1856. But all of this is true if you only consider the deaths of the good guys and ignore the vast number of Sauron and Saruman's servants who perished during the war. Almost all of these deaths are military deaths because the Free Peoples didn't really invade the lands of the enemy. The only exceptions are the Ents tearing apart Isengard and the host of the West invading Udun after Sauron was defeated. And in the end, it's much more difficult to define the differences between combatants and non-combatants when it came to Sauron and Saruman's servants. For example, are orc workers in Isengard combatants or non-combatants? Who knows? The only exact numbers we have on the side of the enemies is that Saruman's force that attacked Helm's Deep numbered at least 10,000, and that the Haradrim at Pelennor Fields numbered at least 18,000. As for the former, the force was almost entirely wiped out. Only some of the Dunlendings were able to surrender. As for the latter, it seems this army was wiped out almost to the last man, as the Haradrim mostly fought to the death, and only rumours of Gondor's wrath reached Harad. This repeated itself across Middle-earth. Most of Sauron's armies were completely wiped out, to the point of where fortresses such as Minas Morgul and Dol Guldur were largely emptied. There were only two exceptions to this, and both actually happened after Sauron's defeat. At Dale, the Easterling army routed without much of a fight, and at the Black Gate, many of Sauron's soldiers fled the field, and some of the men actually even surrendered. In an earlier video where I talked about whether Sauron was in trouble or not after the Battle of Pelennor Fields, I estimated that from the 10th of March to the 24th of March, Sauron may have lost as many as 200,000 soldiers across the Westlands. But that estimate didn't include the troops he lost at the Battle of the Black Gate, nor did it include those Easterlings who were killed while routing from Dale. After that, it might have been as many as 230,000. And then, if you add in the soldiers Saruman lost at Helm's Deep, the Fords of Isen, and at Isengard, you probably start approaching 250,000. The largest portion of these losses would have occurred at the Battle of Pelennor Fields, where upwards of 50,000 of Sauron's soldiers were wiped out in one battle. So, while the losses for the Free Peoples might not have been so high, even compared to previous wars, I don't think the same could be said for Sauron's forces. I'm not quite sure if there was a single war in the Third Age where their losses would have been so high. Maybe the destruction of Angmar comes close, but only because presumably a lot of civilians in Rhudaur and Angmar were also killed. Even then, I doubt it was that high. I think the last time the forces of evil would have sustained so many losses would have been during the War of the Last Alliance. So in conclusion, how many died during the War of the Ring? Well, probably around 300,000, maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less. However, 80% of those deaths belonged to Sauron's armies, which were mostly comprehensively defeated across the length and breadth of the Westlands of Middle-earth. The other 20% amongst the Free Peoples were probably fairly evenly split between military deaths and civilian deaths. Most of the military deaths were sustained by Gondor and Rohan, and most of the civilian deaths probably occurred in Rohan, specifically in the Westfold. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. As these numbers are mostly estimates, please don't walk away from this video assuming that they're canon. Also, feel free to agree or disagree in the comments. Let me know if you believe I was being too conservative with my numbers, or alternatively overestimating. And please do give some numbers of your own if you wish. Cheers, farewell, and remember, if you believe you failed in life, at least be glad that you didn't die in the War of the Ring. Take the small wins.